The hall was enormous. Not the kind of enormous that made people feel important, the kind that made them feel like dust. Tethva stood near the back of the observation platform and watched the 7 humans walk in. He had done this 11 times before. 11 species, 11 slow, careful entrances into the hall of the Axis Prime Station, where the conclave held its welcoming ceremony before sending a new species into the ordeal. He knew every beat of the ceremony. He could have recited the High Speaker's opening words in his sleep. He was already bored. The humans were smaller than he expected. Most new species arrived in some form of ceremonial dress, robes, armor, painted skin, elaborate headgear that communicated rank and history and the particular need every young species had to be taken seriously. And the humans wore dark-fitted clothing with small pockets everywhere. Practical, unremarkable, the kind of clothing you wore when you expected to move. Tethva made a note. He made notes about everything. It was the job. The High Speaker began. His voice filled the hall the way it always did, deep and slow, carrying the weight of 2,000 years of conclave history in every syllable. He welcomed humanity to the gathering of spacefaring peoples. He spoke of the conclave's purpose, to bring order and kinship to the stars, to ensure that those who traveled among them were worthy of the company. He spoke of the ordeal with the particular gentleness used when explaining a very hard thing to someone who didn't yet understand how hard it was going to be. The cradle, he said, was a planetoid at the edge of the Mira system. Poisoned air. The brutal fauna. No tools, no shelter, no technology waiting for them. 7 survival conditions had to be met before the exit gate would open. Food security, shelter, communication, medicine, defense, population stability, resource mapping. Every species that had passed the ordeal had taken at least 11 years. Most took between 30 and 60. The Velkan, Tethva's own people, the fastest in conclave history, had completed it in 9 years and 2 months. It was a record that had stood for 4 centuries. The High Speaker did not say any of this to be cruel. He said it because the conclave believed in honesty. The ordeal was hard. New species needed to know. The humans stood and listened. One of them, the tall one near the middle, and the woman with short gray-streaked hair and the kind of stillness that came from a long time spent making decisions, gave a small nod when the High Speaker finished. Not a bow, a nod. The kind you gave when someone told you something you already knew. Tethva noted that too. Her name was Ruth Alcott. Commander, according to the file. 47 years old. Raised on a large animal farm in the northern interior of the North American continent. Trained as a military field commander. Experienced in what the humans called extreme environment operations. The file was thorough. The conclave always prepared thorough files on trial candidates. It helped the observer understand what they were watching. Tethva had read the file. He still didn't feel like he understood what he was watching. And the others were introduced by the High Speaker in turn. Calvin Osei, young with the easy posture of someone comfortable in his own body, who looked around the great hall with open curiosity rather than awe. Nina Vasquez, a medical specialist, compact and quick-eyed, who was already studying the hall's structure the way a person studied a room they might need to move fast in. The other 4, 2 men, 2 women, stood with a similar contained readiness. Not nervous, not performed, just ready. The ceremony moved into its second phase. The conclave's terms were read aloud by the High Speaker's attendant, a long recitation of rules and conditions, dry and procedural. Tethva watched the humans during this part. Most species showed anxiety here, and the recitation of the ordeal's conditions was long and detailed and designed to communicate the scale of the challenge. Species that didn't fully understand what they were signing up for usually started understanding around the 4th or 5th condition. Calvin said something quietly to the man beside him. The man pressed his lips together like he was trying not to smile. Tethva's translation unit was not close enough to catch it. After the recitation, there was the formal signing. A symbolic gesture, as most of the actual agreements had been processed weeks earlier in digital form. But the conclave valued ritual. Ruth Alcott stepped forward and signed. She used her own pen. She had brought her own pen into the most significant diplomatic hall in the known galaxy. Tethva stared at the pen. It was a very ordinary pen. At the final phase of the ceremony was the procession to the gate. The gate to the cradle was housed in a separate bay, a massive structure that hummed with the energy required to hold a stable transit point across 11 light years. The conclave's delegates lined the path. 61 species represented in full formal dress, watching humanity walk toward the door that 63 species before them had walked through and spent decades walking back out of. The humans walked without ceremony. No formation, no pause. They moved the way people moved when they were going somewhere. Tethva followed at the standard observer distance. His role was to watch from the orbital sensor array. He would not be going through the gate. He would monitor from above as he always did, logging behaviors, noting resource acquisition patterns, and watching the slow, painful process of a new species learning to survive somewhere impossible. He expected to be filing routine reports for the next 11 to 20 years. At the gate, the High Speaker gave the final blessing. It was a good blessing. He had given it 63 times, and it had not lost its meaning. It spoke of courage, of the worth of struggle, of the conclave waiting with open arms on the other side of patience. The humans entered one by one. Ruth Alcott was last. She stopped at the threshold, turned, looked back down the line of delegates, past the High Speaker, past the dignitaries, all the way to where Tethva stood with his observation pad and his ready boredom. She looked directly at him. He didn't know why he was certain it was him specifically. The hall was full. But she looked directly at him for 2 full seconds, and then she said something. Low, not for the room, almost to herself. His translation unit gave him the words 4 seconds later. Let's get this done. The gate closed. The hall returned to its usual hum. Delegates dispersed. The ceremony was over. Tethva walked back toward the observation bay and opened a new file. He titled it, Human Trial, Day 1. He set his notation template to the standard 11-year observation format. Then he paused. He thought about the pen, the nod, the way Calvin had made the other man almost smile during the reading of conditions that usually made species tremble. He kept the 11-year format. But he opened a second document alongside it, blank, and titled it only, Other Things. He didn't know what he expected to put in it. Meant he found out very quickly. The first thing the sensor array showed Tethva was the humans standing in the drop zone. This was normal. Every species stood in the drop zone for a while after the gate closed. The cradle was a hard planet. The air was breathable for most humanoid species, but thick with particulates that irritated the lungs. The temperature varied 50 degrees between the high point of the day and the low point of the night. The vegetation was dense and dark and full of things that ate other things. Most species spent the first several hours simply standing in the drop zone, looking at their new world, processing the reality of where they were and how long they would be there. Ruth Alcott stood still for exactly 6 minutes. Tethva watched her scan the terrain, left to right, slow, methodical, not frightened, reading. It like she was reading a page. Then she pointed. She said something short to the group. 3 words, maybe 4, and the group split. Tethva blinked. Calvin took 3 people and moved northeast at a pace that the sensor array flagged automatically as higher than baseline expected movement for a new environment assessment. He wasn't walking carefully, testing each step the way new arrivals usually did. He was moving with purpose, like the terrain was already familiar, and the only thing that mattered was covering it fast. Nina Vasquez went southwest with 1 other person, Before she had walked 50 meters, she had her kit open. Ruth didn't move. She stood alone at the drop point and kept reading the landscape for another 3 minutes. Then she walked directly toward the largest fauna signature on the planet. The HFY's sensor array highlighted the signature in red. It was a creature the Conclave's preliminary survey had cataloged as an apex predator, roughly 40 meters in length, territorial, responsible for the deaths of 2 survey drones and 1 unmanned probe. The survey team had flagged it as the primary biological threat to any trial participants. Every species briefing mentioned it. The standard advice was to avoid the northeastern valley entirely for the first several years, until numbers could be established and a defensive perimeter slowly, carefully built. Ruth walked toward it like she was going to have a conversation with it. HFY opened a direct channel to his supervisor. His supervisor told him sensor drift was common in early trial phases and that he should log it and move on. The HFY watched Ruth Alcott walk up to the largest predator on the cradle and drive a metal spike into the ground approximately 6 feet from the creature's territorial marker. A scent post, identified by the survey team as the boundary line the creature considered the edge of its space. She drove the spike. She stepped back. She stood there. The creature shifted. It moved its great head toward her. It breathed out, a sound the sensor array rendered as a low mechanical rumble. It didn't attack. It moved away. Not far. Just enough to communicate that the spike and the space beyond it were understood. Ruth retrieved the spike, walked back toward the drop zone, and said something into her communicator that made Calvin laugh loud enough for the sensor array to pick it up. HFY opened his second document. He typed, "Subject approached apex predator. Predator retreated. No aggression, no injury, no explanation." He stared at the sentence for a moment. Then he kept watching. By hour 2, Calvin's group had covered significant ground. They weren't foraging. HFY had watched 11 species forage, and he knew what it looked like. Cautious, slow, reactive, moving toward food sources and away from threats in a pattern driven by immediate need. Calvin's group wasn't doing that. They were mapping. There was a rhythm to the way they moved, a grid-like logic, and Calvin was talking continuously into a small recorder while the others collected samples and marked locations with small flags they had brought. They found 3 fresh water sources, 2 mineral deposits, a lowland area that Nina, when she crossed it on her path south, had identified without stopping as high in edible biomass. "Frankly, rude amount of food down here," she said into her communicator, and kept walking. By hour 4, there was shelter. HFY leaned toward his display. It wasn't big. 7 people didn't need a city, but it was not the rough lean-to structures that species typically threw together in the first weeks of a trial. It had walls that accounted for wind direction. It had a drainage channel cut around the base. It had a roof angle calculated, HFY checked the sensor data, to shed the cradle's heavy rainfall without collapse. They had built it in 2 hours using materials from the immediate environment, working in coordinated pairs, each person apparently knowing their role without discussion. HFY wrote, "Shelter constructed. Hour 4. Drainage channel present. On structural angle non-random. Coordination without observable communication errors." He paused. He added, "No species has achieved functional shelter before day 3. By hour 5, Nina had established a medical station. It was a flat-cleared surface near the shelter with organized supplies in a system HFY could not interpret from above, but which Nina clearly could, because she moved through it the way a person moved through their own kitchen. Calvin's team returned with their mapping data and a quantity of food that exceeded the trial's day 10 threshold for nutritional security. Calvin sat down, ate something he had picked on the way back, and made a face. "Tastes like someone sat on a banana," he said. He ate 3 more. By hour 6, the communication grid was up. This was the part that made HFY stop writing entirely and simply stare. The communication grid was supposed to be one of the later conditions. Species typically built it in year 4 or 5, once enough settlement infrastructure was in place to support it. The humans had built it by stringing a line of devices between trees, devices they had assembled from components HFY could not identify the purpose of until his sensor array ran a material analysis and reported back that the conduction elements were made from a mineral compound found in the local soil, processed using heat and compression, wrapped in stripped bark fiber, and connected to a central unit no larger than a hand. It worked. HFY sat back in his chair. The observation bay was empty except for him. His shift had officially ended 40 minutes ago, but he had not moved. He pulled up his standard 11-year logging template. He looked at it. The template had columns for week-by-week developments, monthly summaries, annual reviews. He collapsed all the annual columns. He changed the timescale to hourly. He opened a third document. He titled it, Anomalous Behaviors, Query for Review. He began to fill it in with everything he had seen in the past 6 hours, writing carefully, in the flat factual language that the conclave required of observers. The document was 4 pages long before the 7th hour had even begun. He sent a note to his supervisor. His supervisor replied that he would review it in the morning. HFY looked at the sensor feed. Ruth was walking the perimeter she had set, slow and steady, checking each point by hand. Calvin had fallen asleep sitting up against a tree with his recorder still running. Nina was reorganizing her medical supplies in the dark by memory. They had been on the cradle for 6 hours. 5 of the 7 trial conditions were already partially underway. HFY didn't know what to write in his 4th document, so he left it open and blank and just kept watching. The message that went out from HFY's station was supposed to be a routine anomaly flag. These went out occasionally. Equipment malfunctions, unexpected weather patterns, rare fauna behavior. The Senior Science Board received dozens of them in a given month and reviewed them when time allowed. They were not urgent. They were not interesting. And they were the background noise of monitoring 63 active conclave members and 1 ongoing trial at any given time. Someone on HFY's staff had labeled this one differently. The label read, Human Trial. Behavior outside all recorded parameters. By the time the 2nd shift began on Axis Prime, there were 40 conclave members crowded into the observation bay that HFY had been sitting alone in for the past several hours. They stood behind him in clusters, talking in low voices, watching the sensor feeds from the cradle. A Thar delegate pressed close to the display showing Calvin's team. A pair of Velcon scientists argued quietly over the material analysis of the communication grid. The high speaker himself stood near the back, not speaking, on watching Ruth walk the perimeter with an expression HFY had never seen on him in 11 trials. Nobody was bored. On the cradle, Hour 7 brought the first real test. One of the humans, a man named Derek, the youngest of the group, took a deep cut across his left forearm from a low-hanging branch tipped with a barbed spine. The cradle's vegetation had several varieties of this. The survey team had documented the toxin in the spine as mildly disruptive to humanoid biochemistry. Not lethal, but capable of causing significant fever and disorientation if the wound wasn't treated within a few hours. Derek made a sound, short and sharp. Nina was beside him in under a minute. The conclave's medical delegate, a species with 8 centuries of advanced biological science behind them, leaned toward the feed as Nina worked. She cleaned the wound with a solution from her kit, extracted the spine fragment with a tool she had clearly made from local materials sometime in the past hour, and then did something that required her full attention for about 4 minutes. A process the medical delegate identified after some delay as a form of biochemical neutralization, using compounds she had processed from the edible plant material Calvin's team had brought back. She had identified the toxin and synthesized a partial counter to it in the field, using plants she had never encountered before, in under 1 hour. The medical delegate said nothing for a long time. Derek, for his part, was laughing. Not because he wasn't in pain. The sensor feed's biometric data was clear that he was. He was laughing because Nina, while working, I was telling him about the worst meal she had ever eaten in considerable and vivid detail, and the story was apparently very good because by the end of it, Derek was laughing and his breathing had steadied and his hand had stopped shaking. The Thar delegate turned to Tethva. "They are laughing," the delegate said. "Why are they laughing?" "It is a stress response," Tethva said. "They use humor to regulate fear." The Thar delegate looked at the feed for another long moment. "They are laughing so that they do not panic? That seems to be the function, yes. And it works?" Tethva looked at Derek's biometric readout. Heart rate dropping, respiration evening out, the shaking in his hand gone. "Yes," he said. "It works." The Thar delegate was very quiet after that. He didn't leave the bay. By hour 9, Ruth had done something that required the Conclave's Xenobiology Board to submit an urgent formal query directly to Tethva's station. She had extended the non-aggression boundary with the apex predator. Not just the one spike from hour 1, she had mapped the creature's territorial markers across a range of about 2 kilometers and had placed a series of indicators at each one, small and unobtrusive, that the creature's sensor profile showed it acknowledging and accepting. The creature had not attacked, it had not fled, it had adjusted. The xenobiology query read, "Please confirm. Is the trial candidate communicating with the apex predator, and if so, how?" Tethva confirmed it. He did not know how. Ruth didn't know they were watching. She was already moving to the next section of the perimeter, checking her work. Adjusting a marker that had shifted in the wind, moving with the easy certainty of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Not with this creature, not on this world, but something close enough that the gap between the two didn't matter. Hour 10. Hour 11. The room was very quiet when the sensor array's condition tracker updated. 5 conditions met. Not partially, fully. Food security, met. Shelter infrastructure, met. Communication grid, operational. Medical capacity, established. Territorial defense, active and functioning. 2 remained. Resource mapping, population stability. Tethva pulled up the comparison data. The Velcon, his own people, fastest in Conclave history. 2 conditions met after 9 months. The humans, 5 conditions in 11 hours. And a Velcan scientist near the back of the room made a sound that Tethva did not have a translation for. Not a word, just a sound. The kind of sound that happened when understanding arrived faster than language could catch it. The high speaker walked up beside Tethva. He stood there for a while without speaking, watching the feeds. "Have you adjusted your observation timeline?" he finally asked. "Several times," Tethva said. The high speaker nodded slowly. He watched Ruth on the feed. She had stopped walking and was sitting on a rock at the edge of the perimeter, eating something, looking out at the tree line with an expression that Tethva's translation protocols identified as contentment, but which felt like something else from here. "She does not look like someone under duress," the high speaker said. "No," Tethva agreed. "She looks like someone at work." Tethva looked at the feed. He looked at the shelter with its drainage channel, at the communication grid strung between trees, at the medical station where Nina was now teaching one of the others how to identify the barbed spines by leaf shape. He looked at Calvin, who had woken up from his accidental nap and was now back on his feet, recorder running, moving in his grid pattern, covering ground. "Yes," Tethva said, "she does." He opened his anomalous behaviors document. It was 39 pages now. He scrolled to the bottom and began to type. He got to the 40th page before hour 12 was done. He closed that document and opened a new one. He stared at the blank page for a moment. Then he typed the title. "What are they?" He didn't write anything else under it yet. He wasn't ready. And he kept watching. The 6th condition fell at hour 17. Tethva had been watching Calvin for the past 3 hours, and he still wasn't entirely sure he believed what he was seeing. Resource mapping was supposed to take years. It required systematic surveying of a planet's surface, mineral deposits, water sources, soil types, elevation data, fauna migration patterns. The Conclave's own pre-trial survey of the cradle had used 12 drones over a 6-month period and produced a map that the Geological Survey Board considered thorough. Calvin was doing it on foot, with a burnt stick. That was not a simplification. The sensor array confirmed it. Calvin was walking the terrain in a deliberate grid pattern, covering ground at a pace that should have been unsustainable for someone on hour 17 of no sleep. Dictating observations into his recorder and writing notes on his own forearm with a piece of charred wood because his notepad had been given to Derek 2 hours ago to use as a splint support. He was narrating as he went. The sensor array picked up enough of it to translate. Elevation drops about 4 meters over the next 30. Good for water runoff, bad for anything you want to keep dry. Mineral color in the rock face here is different. Richer, going to say iron heavy. Nina will know more. Wind direction shifted about 2 hours ago, which means the valley system is doing something interesting, and I want to know what. Remind me. He was talking to nobody. His recorder was running. He was filing information the way a person filed papers, not because someone was watching, but because it was the thing to do. The map that came out of this process took the Conclave's Geological Survey Board 11 minutes to analyze. Their assessment, more accurate than the pre-trial drone survey. Not marginally, significantly. Calvin had identified 2 mineral deposits the drones had missed, 3 fault lines that affected subsurface water movement, and a seasonal wind pattern that had not appeared in any of the survey data because the survey had been conducted in the wrong season. He had done this with his feet, his eyes, and a piece of burnt wood. The Conclave's engineering delegate had been in the middle of a briefing on unrelated matters when the assessment came through. The delegate stopped speaking mid-sentence, just stopped, looked at the data, did not resume the briefing. Nobody in the room asked him to. Hour 19 arrived, and with it, the 7th and final condition, population stability. This was the one the Conclave had always been most confident in. It was designed carefully. Governance under extreme stress was a known breaking point for young species. The pressure of the trial, the exhaustion, the danger, the isolation, pushed social structures to their limits. Hierarchies cracked. Arguments became fights. Fights became fractures. Fractures meant failed governance. Failed governance invalidated the stability condition. It was elegant in its simplicity. No species had ever found it easy. The humans voted on who took the next watch rotation. Tethva watched this with the specific attention he now gave to everything the humans did, because he had learned in the past 19 hours that dismissing anything they did as trivial was a mistake. They had a system. It was not a complicated system. Each person stated their preference. The group weighed the options. Not argued, weighed, there was a difference, and arrived at an outcome. 2 people got the shift they wanted. 2 people got their second preference. 3 people, including Calvin, got neither. Calvin looked at the result. He nodded. He made a remark. The 2 people nearest to him covered their mouths. Tethva's translation unit was faster now. It had been calibrated over 19 hours of near-constant listening. Calvin had said, "This is fine. I have survived worse things. I survived my sister's wedding. I can survive anything." Nobody argued about the shift rotation. Nobody made it about fairness or rank or exhaustion levels, or any of the dozens of factors that had unraveled governance systems in prior trials. They just voted, accepted the result, and moved on. The stability conditions monitoring algorithm took 40 seconds to process what it had observed. Then it logged. Condition met. 6, 7. All 7 conditions met. Tethva stared at the display. The observation bay had 63 people in it now, which was almost certainly a fire violation by conclave station standards. But nobody had left since the sixth condition fell, and now they all stood very still, looking at the same thing Tethva was looking at. The gate mechanism's status light had changed from inactive to warming. It had not been in warming status since the previous trial 6 years ago. It required 12 minutes to reach operational power, and the sound it made during warm-up was a low, steady tone, barely audible, but the sensor array on the cradle would pick it up. On the feed, Ruth looked up. She heard it. She stood still for a moment with her head tilted, listening. Then she said one word into her communicator. The translation came back as, "Ready." She didn't celebrate. She didn't call out, didn't raise her arms, didn't do any of the things that prior species had done, and they had all done things, because finishing the ordeal was the end of a decade or more of grueling survival, and the relief was enormous, and it showed. Ruth heard the tone and said, "Ready," and turned to check that everyone was at the gate area with their kit. Calvin got there last, still talking into his recorder, finishing a note. He clicked it off, tucked it in his pocket, then looked around at the rest of the group with an expression Tethva had learned to read over the course of the day as contentment mixed with the specific tiredness of someone who had done a hard thing well. "So," Calvin said, "are we early?" Nobody answered because everyone was too tired to do the math, and also because the answer was so large it didn't feel real. The 12 minutes stretched out. Tethva looked at his fourth document, the one he had titled, "What Are They?" It was still mostly blank. He had written a few lines over the past several hours and deleted them because they weren't right. Too simple, too grand, too narrow. He looked at the feeds. Nina repacking her kit with the same system she'd used all day. Derek testing the arm that had been injured, rotating it slowly, satisfied with the movement. Two of the others sitting close together, not talking. The easy quiet of people who had been through a long day side by side and didn't need words for it. Ruth standing at the edge of the gate area looking back at the planet. Not nostalgic, not relieved. Just looking. The way you looked at work you had done before you left it. Tethva started typing. He wrote slowly this time, not logging anomalies, not flagging behaviors for review, just writing in the plain, honest way he wrote when something mattered. "They did not hurry," he wrote. "They were never hurrying. This is what they do normally. The trial did not push them. They simply moved at the speed they move, and the trial happened to fit inside one day." He stopped. Read it back. It wasn't wrong. He kept going. The gate tone shifted pitch, 1 minute remaining. And the humans picked up their kit. The gate opened. It made the sound it always made, a deep, resonant release of pressure, like something very large exhaling after holding its breath for a long time. Light came through first, the clean, steady light of the Axis Prime Bay, and then the humans walked through it, one after another, back into the station they had left 24 hours ago. They looked like what they were. Tired. Dirty. Operating on the particular alertness of people who had gone past the edge of their energy reserves and were now running on something thinner and steadier underneath. Nina had a bandage on her left forearm from a minor burn she'd treated herself without stopping work. Calvin was missing the sleeve of his jacket. He had cut it off around hour 15 to wrap a sample he didn't want to lose. Then Derek walked carefully, but walked on his own. Ruth came through last. She looked exactly the same as she had going in, except her eyes were doing something different. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter. The look of a person who had done what they went to do and was already thinking about what came next. The observation bay held more people than Tethva had ever seen in it. 61 conclave delegates, the senior science board, the medical board, the high speaker, and a collection of staff and observers who had drifted in over the course of the day and simply not left. The room had been building its silence for the last hour as the gate warmed up. Now the humans were through the gate, and the silence was complete. The high speaker stepped forward. He had given this speech 63 times. He knew every word of it. At the formal welcome of a species that had passed the ordeal into full conclave membership. The history of the organization, the rights and responsibilities of membership, the names of every species that had come before. It was a good speech. He had refined it over centuries. Hearing it was, for species that had just survived decades in the cradle, one of the most significant moments of their existence. He had taken one breath to begin when Ruth Alcott spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't address the room. She just looked at the high speaker with a calm and direct attention and said the two words in the easy tone of someone continuing a conversation rather than starting one. "What's next?" Nobody laughed. Nobody knew how yet. The room held the two words and sat with them. The high speaker looked at her for a long moment. And he was 2,000 years old. He had spent most of those years in rooms exactly like this one, managing the careful and dignified pace of conclave business, the long, patient work of building trust between species who thought in very different ways. He had developed, over those centuries, the ability to adjust to most things. He was adjusting now. It was visible. "There are formalities," he said. Ruth nodded. "Okay. The membership ceremony, the charter reading, the introductions to each delegation." "We're ready," she said. Not impatient, not dismissive. Just ready. The same word she had said on the cradle when she heard the gate tone. It seemed to be her natural state. The ceremony happened. It was shorter than usual because somewhere around the third section of the charter reading, yet the room had quietly shifted its understanding of what was happening. This was not a young species being welcomed into wisdom and guidance. This was 7 tired people in dirty clothes being formally added to a list they had already proven they belonged on before anyone had time to prepare a proper speech about it. Tethva stood in his usual spot near the back. He watched the handshakes, the formal words, the slow procession of delegates welcoming each human in turn. Calvin shook hands with a Velcon scientist who immediately pulled out a recording device and started asking questions that Calvin answered with his recorder still in his pocket, pulling it out and playing back sections of his day's narration, and the two of them talking over each other in the particular excited way of people who had just found someone else who thought about the same things they thought about. Nina was in a corner, talking to the conclave's medical delegate. She had her kit open on a table between them. The medical delegate had 16 degrees across 7 centuries of biological study. He was taking notes. Derek was sitting down, which was fair. Ruth was standing in the center of the room, moving through each delegation in turn, steady and unhurried, saying the right thing to each one, asking one question of each delegate that was specific enough to show she had done her reading before walking through that gate. Not performing. Working. The way she did everything. Tethva watched her and thought about the moment at the gate that morning. The way she had looked directly at him across that full and formal room. The words the translator had given him 4 seconds later. He had written those words in his document. He had written a lot of things in his documents. 214 pages across 4 files, by the final count. Behavior logs, anomaly flags, scientific queries, and the one document he had struggled with all day, the one titled, "What Are They?" He had finished that one while the gate was warming up. He read it back now, standing in the bay, watching the humans move through the crowd. He had written, "They did not complete the trial because they are exceptional. They completed it because for them, this was the trial behaving normally. The cradle was difficult. They have done difficult before. Every single day of their history, they have done difficult. How we designed the ordeal to reveal what a species is under pressure. The humans showed us. I am not sure we were ready to see it." He had added one more line after that. He hadn't planned to. It had just arrived. They are not what I expected when the gate opened. They are something I did not know to expect. There may be a difference." He submitted the document to the permanent archive that evening. It was the longest observation record in conclave history. The previous record had been filed after the Velcon trial, 80 pages over 9 years. The next morning, he received a message from the senior records office. They had processed his reassignment request, which he had submitted during Hour 22. He had been assigned as the human delegation's permanent conclave liaison. He read the assignment. He sat with it for a while. Then he sent back one word: accepted. Then he found Ruth Alcott in the diplomatic wing, where she was already 3 meetings into a schedule she had apparently built for herself between the gate and breakfast. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. "Tethva," she said. Not a question. She already knew his name. He came in. He sat down across from her. He had a great many things he could have opened with. Questions about the apex predator, about the communication grid, about why Calvin had cut off his own sleeve, about the laughing during surgery. His document had 214 pages of things he wanted to understand. He picked the one that had been sitting in him longest. "The words you said at the gate," he said, "when you looked back at me." She waited. You already knew you were going to finish it that day," he said. "Didn't you?" Ruth considered this. Not long. She wasn't someone who took long with things she had already thought about. "We knew what we were capable of," she said. "We'd just never had a reason to show anyone else." Tethva nodded. He thought about that. He thought about 63 species walking through that gate across 2,000 years. He thought about all the hard decades and the slow, painful growth and the relief on their faces when the gate finally opened. He thought about the conclave's careful patience, its long wisdom, its certainty about how things worked and what things meant. He thought about Ruth pausing at the threshold that morning, looking back, and saying 3 quiet words. "Let's get this done." Not brave, not defiant. I'm just a woman who knew how long something would take and was already thinking past it. He opened his notepad. "So," he said, "what is next?" The corner of Ruth's mouth moved, just slightly. "Now that," she said, "is the right question."